The passage that Natalia read for us this morning falls out into two major parts. In verses 1 through 4, God describes his servant. In verses 5 through 7, however, God addresses his servant. Now, this first section of verses is quoted in Matthew chapter 12, verses 18 through 21. And in that context, it is quoted in connection with Jesus' ministry of healing. And so it would be natural for us to see the servant's ministry as an expression of God's mercy. But in its original context, that is not how this ministry is presented. Rather, it is presented as an expression of God's justice. Now let's walk through this passage and let's see how this is all worked out in the prophet's vision. And I want you to begin actually with verse 5. Because in verse 5, we have God's self-identification. It's the first thing we want to look at this morning, is God's self-identification. And it is interesting how God presents himself in this passage. He does not present himself as the Holy One of Israel, as we have seen on at least a couple of occasions in our study of Isaiah 40 through 55. There are lots of other ways that God could present himself. He doesn't present himself as for example, God of goodness, like he does in Exodus 33. No, we see another couple of familiar refrains in this verse. We see God as creator and God as life giver. Now, why is this important? Why does God present himself this way? Now, I think one reason can be seen in the larger context. Remember, one of the things that we said about Isaiah 40 through 55 is that repeatedly it emphasizes that idols are nothing and can do nothing. Well, one of the places that it emphasizes that is in the second half of chapter 41. So it seems that God is making this contrast between the idols who can't do anything and himself who has done everything. But there may be something else at play here too. We'll come back to that in a few moments. So we looked at God's self-identification. Another thing that we want to look at as we prepare to closely examine the servant's ministry is we want to look at what God promises to do for the servant. Now, in this case, unlike what we talked about last week, God's promises to the servant are not about reward. They are about helping the servant do what God has called the servant to do, helping the servant be who God has called the servant to be. And so, our text, especially verses 1 through 4, but 5 through 7 as well, emphasize God's presence with the servant, God's protection of the servant. Now there's some irony there given what we studied last week, the suffering psalm, but it's still there, right? So presence, protection, support. God promises his support for the servant, and God promises that he will empower the servant. But I think what's interesting and perhaps important for how we read the prophets in general is that God does not make these promises in the kind of conceptual way that I just did for you. He doesn't list them out that way. No. He uses much more picturesque language. Language that calls us to imagine what God is doing for and through this servant. Language like, I will put my Spirit upon him or in him. Right? So we're seeing how God is laying the foundation for this servant's ministry. But now we want to turn our attention to that ministry itself. And that's really what we're going to spend our time focusing on. Now, one of the foundations of that ministry is God's character, the way God presents himself. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. One of the foundations is what God is going to be doing in the life of the servant. But one of the foundations is the servant's character itself. And if you were reading carefully along with Natalia, you may have noticed two things that God highlights about the servant. He highlights the servant's faithfulness and the servant's righteousness. So, faithfulness and righteousness. Now, let's take each one of those in turn. Look there in verses 3 and 4. Okay? It says that in faithfulness, the servant will bring forth justice, right? Now, if you'll remember, when we've talked about this word faithfulness before, we've emphasized two aspects of its meaning. We have emphasized faithfulness as fidelity to one's word, and we've emphasized faithfulness as honesty, okay? But actually, that's not what God is doing here as he describes this servant. Keep reading there, and what you see is that this servant is faithful in that he keeps on plugging away at the work that God has given him to do. He is steadfast. He perseveres. He perseveres in the work to which God has called him. He doesn't give up. And then down in verse 6, I think it is, we see this in righteousness. Now, righteousness is a very interesting term in the Old Testament. It has some different shades of meaning. And the truth is, we don't have, unlike with faithfulness, we don't have a whole lot of clues about what this righteousness means. But I want to get you thinking about something. I've said to you before that righteousness is something like that old Southern tradition of saying about someone, well, you know, he just does right by people. And by the way, we usually say it about a man for some reason. We don't usually say that about women. We say that about a man. He just does right by people. Now, when we say that, we're not saying, are we, that he always gives people what they deserve. No. In fact, a lot of times what we're saying is that he treats people according to their need rather than according to what they deserve. Right? Okay? He does a good turn to people even when they don't deserve it. I think that is close to the idea of righteousness in the Old Testament. It's not surprising that it might be a little close to that because you're talking about two somewhat traditional cultures. And traditional cultures sometimes have a better understanding of this notion of treating people in the right way than, say, bureaucratic cultures do. Bureaucratic cultures are very rules-based. We follow the rules, we follow the processes and the procedures. And, in bureaucratic cultures, we worry that any deviation from the norms could be a sign of corruption, okay? And that's not an unreasonable worry, okay? And this is not to say that traditional cultures are generally better for people than bureaucratic cultures. That's not my point. But it is to say that sometimes in these less formal cultures, we see perhaps a better understanding of right interactions between people, because there aren't these bureaucratic norms to hide behind. You have to actually make a decision how you are going to treat a particular person. So faithfulness and righteousness are the character out of which this ministry emerges. But what is the quality of this ministry? What is its character? How does it work? Those are really kind of the same thing, the character of the ministry and how it works. Well, there's a couple of things that you notice, again, there in verse 6. This servant, the text tells us, will be a covenant for the people. Now, we've seen this before. When a couple of weeks ago, when we looked at Isaiah 49, we saw this very same phrase. And you'll remember that I told you back then, some translators want to take this and say, well, no, he must be saying that the servant will be a covenant mediator. Because how can a person be a covenant? Makes sense, right? Except that sometimes we use language in a kind of boundary-breaking way, just like that, in order to communicate something deeper, something more meaningful, something that transcends the bonds of normal human language. Think about it this way. John 1:1 says that in the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Equating Christ with the Word. Well, how can a person also be a Word? Or in John 14:6, Jesus says about himself, I should say, I am the truth. How can a person be truth? Right? Or all over 1 John, God is love. Well, again, whatever love is, it's somewhere on the border between emotion, decision, and action. Somewhere in that interchange there is love. How can a person be love? And yet, we know that Jesus is the Word. We know that He is the truth. We know that God is love. In the same way, I propose to you, we should take this just as it is written. The servant is the covenant for the people. He is the tie that binds them to one another and to God. It also says that this servant will be a light to the nations. Now, it's been a little while since we've talked about this metaphor of light, but you'll remember that metaphor is used all over the ancient Near East, the Greek world, the Roman world. It was a common metaphor in the Mediterranean. And light is a comfort. Light speaks to safety and provision. Let me tell you something. If you are making a journey in the middle of the night in the ancient Near East or in the ancient Mediterranean, you want to see light. Light does not simply illuminate, which it does. Light gives warmth. Light proclaims that safety and security might well be in reach. And that turns our attention to verse 7. To whom is this ministry addressed? Who are the recipients of this ministry, we might say? Well, the recipients of this ministry are the weak, the vulnerable. That's what we see up there in verse 3, verses 2 and 3, right? A bruised reed he will not break. Right? And I love the fact that the prophet uses, again, imaginative, pictorial imagery. He doesn't say the servant is for the weak. He uses this image, or these two images, really, to show us. And he does it in such an understated way. It's sort of like, when you're in high school and a friend of yours comes up to you and says, "Hey, what do you think about old Natasha?" Whatever. And you say, "Yeah, she ain't bad." That's code for, I think she's the most beautiful girl who ever lived, right? Understatement. The same thing here. Oh, he's not going to break a bruised reed. If there's a smoldering candle wick, he's not going to extinguish it. Saying something, in fact, much more profound. Now, if you look at, there's 3 lines there in verse 7. If you look at the second 2, the last 2, you see another group for whom this ministry is intended. It is intended for the oppressed. Now, in order to really make sense of this, and I was doing some reading this week, and I didn't really even think about this until somebody pointed it out, and it was one of those slap your forehead moments. Hardened criminals are not the people that are in view as you look at those last 2 lines of verse 7. Hardened criminals would have been executed. Now in Egypt, that's not how it went. Egypt didn't use capital punishment that much. They would use it, but not that much. But in the ancient Near East, they did. No. Who are the people who are imprisoned in Israel, among the Philistines, in other parts of Canaan, in Assyria, Babylon? They are what we would call the political prisoners. They are the prisoners of war. They are debtors. They are perhaps escaped slaves until they're either given back to their masters or executed. The people who find themselves in dungeons in the ancient Near East are the people who are oppressed. And again, this wonderful pictorial imagery. People knew immediately what the prophet was talking about. And yet, there is also room for imagination. But now I want you to turn your attention to that first line of verse 7. He will bring sight to the blind. Are we to take this literally? Possibly. Jesus certainly did that. But I don't think that's the primary intent. Are we to take it, as some scholars have suggested, as just a parallelism for the other 2 lines? Because after all, if you've been in a dungeon for a long time and then you come out into the light, your eyes are just not used to seeing light at all, and so it's going to be blinding at first. I don't think that works either. No. I think the reference here is back to verse 6. What is it that the blind cannot see? Light. He is referring to the ignorant, those who do not know, those who do not understand, those who live their lives in captivity to ways of thinking and ways of doing that are bad for them. Actually, Natalia and I were just talking about this last night. And I know I've said this to you before, but I think it's worth repeating. In fact, I think it's worth repeating every Sunday if we have to. Repentance is a precious gift. It is astounding how ignorant we as humans can be of our own dysfunction. How it seems so clear and so obvious to everybody else, but we can't see it. The illuminating work of the servant is designed to open the eyes of people who would otherwise be blind. Blind to their own sinfulness, blind to the brokenness of the world, blind to the idiocy of idolatry in all of its many forms. But having spoken briefly about these recipients of the ministry, we also need to note that this ministry is universal in its scope. It is for the people, yes, and that's usually a reference to the people of Israel, but it is also for the nations, or if you will, for the Gentiles. But perhaps the most important thing that we need to note in the long shadow, oh, by the way, let me stop here. I almost forgot to say this. This is why, another reason why, I should say, this is why God describes himself the way that he does. He describes himself as creator and life giver, and not first and foremost as covenant maker or keeper with Israel, because the servant's scope of ministry extends far beyond the traditional covenant people. But beyond that, in the shadow of this understanding of how the ministry of the servant works and of to whom it is intended or for whom it is intended, we need to observe the singular goal of this ministry. 3 times in verses 1 through 4, we see this word justice. The ministry of the servant is a ministry of justice. And that's really where we want to conclude this morning. It's how we want to park ourselves for a moment. Okay? Because when we hear that word justice, we tend to think in terms of what I deserve, or how I should be rewarded, or how I should be punished for the bad or good things that I've done. And of course, we might have the Christian rapper Lecrae Moore's words rolling around in our head. If we all demanded our rights, we'd be in hell tonight. But as C.S. Lewis points out in his reflections on the Psalms, that's not how the Old Testament talks about justice. It doesn't talk about justice in the same way that our criminal law code does. It talks about it more in the way that our civil law code does. Now, that's a bit of an anachronistic distinction, because in the ancient world they didn't have the distinction between criminal and civil law. Perhaps you see little nascent hints of it in certain places, but generally speaking, they don't have that distinction, okay? But I actually think that Lewis is onto something by pointing our attention to the different ways in which justice is presented in the Bible. And in this case, justice is not so much about the punishment of evildoers as it is about the righting of the wrongs of life. And it is that kind of justice that all of us cry out for. It is that kind of justice that actually breaks the bonds of our criminal law system. Is there anything criminal about an 8-year-old being diagnosed with brain cancer? Dying before they have a chance to live? No, but it still feels profoundly unfair. Is there anything criminal, speaking of cancer, about a beautiful woman being diagnosed with breast cancer and having her body marred and torn to shreds by that evil? No. And yet, we all see it as just a profoundly regrettable circumstance. Is there anything necessarily criminal about a person being born into a particular country and a particular class where they have really no opportunity to escape poverty in this world? Not necessarily. And yet, it hurts us deeply. We know that such a circumstance is not good. So when the Messiah comes, when the servant comes and heals the sick, when the servant comes and advocates for the disenfranchised, when the servant comes and joins the lonely, when the servant comes and walks with the grieving, these are not some kind of special act of mercy, something undeserved. They are expressions of God's justice. Now, sure enough, the servant's ministry is a ministry of mercy. He brings forgiveness, after all. He brings enlightenment to those of us who don't deserve it. But it is also a ministry of justice. And we can rejoice in that ministry. That too is part of the Christmas story. But I will also tell you this. Remember that our theme over the last 2 years has been, what is it that God expects of His people? That's the question we've been asking. And you'll remember that as we studied Matthew's Gospel, what we learned is that, at least for Jesus' part, what He expects is for us to imitate Him, to join Him in His work, sort of to use Blackaby's old language. Well, His work is a work of mercy, but it is also a work of justice. Let us pray.